There we go. All right, we'll be covering the last 16 slides of female reproduction, and then we'll have the exam review, the study guide, which, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but I'll just kind of go through it. So we'll do this, last lecture, go over the exam. The actual exam, actually both the lecture and lab exams are going to be on Monday. I'll be emailing everybody as far as the times. I think it's just going to be the same as we've always had it for the morning and afternoon when it's available. I will be sending you out a practice lab exam sometime later today or tomorrow. I know lab has kind of been challenging with anatomy, not being able to have the actual models that you can handle and things like that. But hopefully you come away from this learning a fair amount. We're actually doing the same thing in the fall too. We're actually going to be doing all online. So hopefully that'll be the end of it. And then spring, we'll be getting back to normally being on campus. All right. Okay, so let's go through this. Okay, so where we left off was just kind of the end of the ovarian and uterine cycles, which are part of the menstrual cycle. I'm just going to spend a couple minutes going over it, just because there is a lot involved, and just to sort of refresh everybody. So you can see here, this diagram is showing the 4 different components of the cycle. We have the production of hormones from the pituitary gland, FSH and LH. We've got the events that are going on in the ovary, the development of the egg. We've got the hormones produced in the ovary. And then finally, we actually have the effects that are on the endometrium of the uterus. So if I were to draw a line, actually they already did, but I'll just mention it, down the middle, everything to the left of this line is pre-ovulatory or before ovulation. Everything afterward, everything to the right is after ovulation. So if we take a look at the events that are occurring prior to ovulation, first thing that we see, kind of hard to tell from this picture, but there's an increase in FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, which triggers the development of these follicles. And remember, they're housing the primary oocytes. As the FSH levels go up, so does estrogen, because remember, estrogen is produced by those follicular cells that surround the egg. As the eggs get bigger, so does the amount of estrogen. It spikes. And estrogen targets the uterus by stimulating the proliferation of that functional layer, the thickening of it, kind of the development. And this is kind of a positive feedback, in the sense that as the eggs get larger, more estrogen, thicker lining, eventually we reach a point right around here where we have that, remember, that mature or the Graafian follicle. And high levels of estrogen, we get then a spike in LH and FSH, which is driven by the estrogen, causes the spike. This causes ovulation. The oocyte is released into the uterine tube. What's left, those follicular cells, the cells transform into the corpus luteum, which is producing progesterone, as you can see in this with this green part of the graph. Some estrogen, but progesterone is really the dominant force here. Progesterone also acts on the uterus, causing a further thickening of it, but also the development of these secretory glands that are producing substances that are going to help support and nurture the developing embryo. The names of these phases, remember, prior to ovulation in the ovary, it's called the follicular phase. Even though they combine the menstruation here, I'm going to start off really with the proliferative phase to show that this thickening in the proliferative phase corresponds with the follicular phase. We have ovulation, and then the secretory phase, which corresponds with the luteal phase. If the egg that's released is not fertilized and does not implant in the uterus, that the corpus luteum will shrink, degenerate, progesterone levels will decrease, and this will cause a thinning out of the lining, which occurs during menstruation. All right. And then here we spoke about how FSH induces an increase in estrogen, which at high levels has a positive feedback to cause a further increase in FSH and LH, which will lead to a surge. It's called the ovulatory surge. And then after ovulation, we'll have progesterone levels mostly go up. If there's no fertilized egg, progesterone decreases, and then the cycle starts all over again. So that's kind of the endocrine and organ events that are taking place throughout what we call a non-fertile menstrual cycle, meaning that the egg is not fertilized. Now, what happens if the egg is fertilized, or what allows it to be fertilized? Well, the sperm, as I mentioned, produced in the seminiferous tubules, right? But they're not mature yet. Remember, I mentioned that they have to undergo further development, get more motility in the epididymis, right? Well, even once they go through the epididymis, they're still unable to fertilize an egg, even in the female reproductive tract, until we have a couple key events that are necessary in the female reproductive tract. Well, one event in particular is extremely important. This is called the acrosome reaction. And assuming a sperm cell reaches the egg, in order to fertilize an egg, it has to get through that zona pellucida that I was talking about earlier. Well, in order for it to do that, that acrosome that I mentioned, this cap right here is chock full of enzymes you see in the red. And there's what's called the acrosome reaction. When the sperm reaches the egg, the acrosome ruptures, releases the enzymes which bore a hole in the zona pellucida, allowing the sperm to penetrate, thereby fertilizing the egg. Now, after the egg is fertilized, and this is also quite fascinating, it's very important for only one sperm to fertilize an egg. Just thinking of chromosomes, there's 23 chromosomes in a sperm cell, 23 chromosomes in an egg. That's 46. That's like a full complement of chromosomes in a diploid cell. If another sperm fertilizes that egg, we're going to have too many chromosomes, and this can lead to abortion, basically a non-viable embryo. So to prevent this, we have what's called the cortical reaction. And the cortical reaction occurs after that sperm, and you can see it right there. Well, there it is. After the sperm penetrates the egg, you see this other sperm is trying to get through, but it can't. That's because once the egg is fertilized, it's called the cortical reaction, granules are released that create kind of a protective barrier to prevent what we call polyspermy, or more than one sperm fertilizing an egg. So that's kind of the after fertilization, to prevent a second sperm from fertilizing an egg. The acrosome reaction is required for fertilization. If we take a look at this slide here, you can see both of those reactions, both of those events. First of all, here's the acrosome reaction, and here you have a sperm approaching the egg. This is the zona pellucida. The sperm gets closer. This cap, or the acrosome, releases its enzymes that allow the sperm to penetrate the egg. at least the head, and that's all that has to reach the egg. Once that occurs, we have these what are called cortical granules that accumulate, and these cortical granules effectively block any other sperm from getting through. All right, so an egg is fertilized. What happens next? So remember, an egg is fertilized. We were talking about the uterine tube or the fallopian tube. An egg is fertilized in the ampulla part of the fallopian tube. Once the egg is fertilized, then it undergoes a transport into the uterus that takes about 4 or 5 days. And of course, this is dependent upon cilia and muscle in the fallopian tube to transport it. As it's being transported, the cell divides. I'm not going to get into all the embryology, but basically it divides several times, eventually forming a ball of cells called a blastocyst, kind of a hollow ball of cells. And it's this blastocyst that's going to eventually implant, starting roughly at around day 6. I know it says days 5 to 9, but starting roughly at about day 6. The part of the blastocyst that becomes the embryo or the individual is the inner cell mass. These other structures, we'll talk about these out here. These are very important in the implantation process, but it's the inner cell mass that becomes the baby. Oops. All right, so let's talk a little bit about implantation. Blastocyst, like I mentioned, consists of the inner cell mass, and it also consists of 2 other outer layers called the cytotrophoblast and the syncytiotrophoblast. You can see roughly around day 6, this fertilized egg, or really now blastocyst, begins to embed in the uterus, in the uterine lining. This is the endometrium. And eventually it's completely engulfed and it's underneath, and I'll show you a picture of that later. Now, one of the things that's quite fascinating is, remember I mentioned that if there is no fertilized egg, the egg isn't fertilized, and if the egg doesn't implant, then progesterone levels decrease from the corpus luteum. But if pregnancy does occur, then the corpus luteum does not shrink. So the question is, how does it know? There's a hormone called HCG that's produced by this implanted blastocyst that goes into the blood, goes to the corpus luteum, and keeps it active, keeps stimulating it to make progesterone. This is called the pregnancy indicator because this is when someone wants to know if they're pregnant, they go to a pharmacy, get that pregnancy test kit, and what that kit is measuring are levels of HCG. This is another view of implantation, starting with this step. There's the endometrium, eventually slowly embedding. And then here it is completely underneath. Here's the endometrium. It's completely underneath, so it'd be like right up here. So it's really enclosed, protected, and housed within that endometrium. Now, implantation normally occurs in the endometrium, right around this area or here. But there are certain times when it's implanted in what we call inappropriate places, or places that are not well suited for the development of the egg. This is what we call an ectopic pregnancy, which can occur in, as you can see, what we call tuber or tubal, various places along the uterine tube. It can occur actually, interestingly, within the ovary, which is very rare. It can also occur in the cervix, which is also rare. Can also occur in the abdominal cavity. And this has to do with it being, once it's fertilized, it kind of falls out here. There's a little space. So these are areas where that would not be conducive for the egg to grow. And so this can result in a pregnancy that doesn't make it to term. Many cases it can be very painful, and so sometimes surgery intervention has to occur. So these are what we call ectopic pregnancies, where a egg is implanted once it's fertilized in areas outside of where it would in the body of the uterus. All right. Now, one important structure in groups of mammals that are actually called placental mammals, like us, is the placenta. Now, what is the significance of the placenta? The placenta is a region, actually it's an organ, believe it or not. It's a transient organ, only lasting for a matter of months, but it's very important. It's an organ that allows for delivery or movement of materials between the fetus and the mother. It allows nutrients and oxygen to go from the mother to the fetus, and allows waste and CO2 to go from the fetus to the mother. And it also has endocrine functions. Now, what do we know about the anatomy of the placenta? Okay, so if you think of the baby as being over here, this part of the placenta is called the chorion. It's what we call the fetal portion of the placenta. This part over here is called the decidua, or the maternal part of the placenta. Okay. Now I mentioned there's transport of material between the fetus and the mother, and that's very effective. Now there's another element of here that must occur, and that is during this transport, the blood of the fetus, the circulation must never be in contact with the blood of the mother. That's because even though the fetus is genetically related to the mother, it's not identical. So there would be an immune response that could be devastating. So if we take a look at this picture, this represents maternal blood vessels, in which you see in red and also blue, but let's just take a look at the red ones. These maternal red blood vessels, they go over into this side from the maternal side to the fetal side, and you can see all this red right here. This is blood, maternal blood, that's basically bathing these, what are called, these little trees known as villi. We spoke about villi with the digestive system, with the intestine, but these are villi. These are fetal blood vessels. The maternal blood, the contents of the maternal blood diffuse across, see where that little white area is? Diffuse across there and enter into the fetal blood vessels. But there's never a direct interaction between the maternal blood and the fetal blood, just movement of gases and nutrients. The vessel that eventually supplies the baby with nutrients and oxygen is what's known as the umbilical vein. Kind of like what you would think of as the pulmonary vein in us, which delivers oxygen-rich blood to the heart. This umbilical vein delivers oxygen-rich blood to the baby. And these are just some other pictures showing this is the fetus, this is the baby right here, this is all the placenta. And you can see all these villi, the baby's blood vessels. This on the outside, these are the maternal blood vessels. And this is later term. This was what, from a 4-week baby. This is from a 13-week. So you can see the placenta is still there. This is just another picture illustrating the exchange of materials. These are the maternal arteries. These are the blood vessels of the baby, and you can see the blood from the mother leaks out into this space and just eventually fuses into the maternal vessels, which are then carried to the baby through what we call the umbilical veins. So the baby's blood vessels are found in what are called the villi, chorionic villi, and there we have the maternal blood vessels. All right. Now the placenta, besides having all this important impact in transport, also is an endocrine gland. produces many hormones, as you can see from this list, some which are normally produced in the ovary, right? And as well as other areas, but it also, the role is taken over by the placenta. And there's three that I want you to know. The first one is HCG, which you've already heard of, which stands for human chorionic gonadotropin. This is, remember, the pregnancy indicator that this is produced, travels in the blood to the corpus luteum and stimulates it to keep cranking out progesterone, which is important in sustaining the pregnancy. We certainly don't want progesterone to decrease, because then that would essentially destroy the protection that the baby has by sloughing off the endometrium. There's another hormone called chorionic somatomammatropin. It's got a couple roles, but I want to mention one thing here, and this is its role in supplying energy to the fetus. This is normally when someone eats, right, all the nutrients in the blood from the intestine go into the blood and deliver nutrients to all that person's tissues. But in a pregnant mother, what actually happens is those nutrients some of them need to go to the baby and not go into the mother's tissues. So this is a way of delivering those nutrients that otherwise would go into the mother, making sure they reach the baby. Finally, the hormone called relaxin, which very good name for it. This is a hormone that is produced in the later stages of pregnancy. It relaxes the cervix and essentially weakens the pubic symphysis. You remember that structure, that fibrocartilage between the os coxae. When it weakens it, it allows it to open up or expand, which will accommodate the head of the baby. So those are three of the hormones I want you to know. Now, the final step of pregnancy is parturition, which is another name for labor and delivery. And it's a very well orchestrated, very well coordinated process that involves essentially interaction between the baby and the mother, right? So here's the baby that's in the uterus. And at later stages of pregnancy, towards the end, the baby drops in the uterus, puts pressure on the cervix. This is the cervix, right? That pressure on the cervix activates some nerves, sensory nerves that travel to the hypothalamus that trigger the production of a hormone called oxytocin. Many women who are late to term, they say their pregnancy has gone 40 weeks, or typically for a full-term pregnancy, but they're not contracting. Doctors will give them a dose of what's called Pitocin, which is a synthetic version of oxytocin. It's produced in the hypothalamus, then released from the posterior pituitary, travels in the blood, reaches the uterus, stimulates contractions. At the same time oxytocin is stimulating contractions, there's another hormone produced in the uterus called prostaglandins, and prostaglandins essentially exacerbate those contractions, making them stronger. So there's kind of like a two-pronged approach to contractions. We have both oxytocin and prostaglandins. This is a positive feedback in the sense that the greater the contractions are, this puts more pressure on the cervix, which is going to activate a sensory nerve, cause more oxytocin, more prostaglandins, and this is going to continue until the baby's born. Now, estrogen has a very important role in this process. I mean, besides having an important role in follicular development and thickening of the uterus, it also activates the placenta so that it's able to respond to oxytocin. Basically, estradiol or estrogen, it stimulates the production of oxytocin receptors that will prime the uterus to be able to respond. to oxytocin. Because if you don't have the receptors, you can't respond. So more receptors, greater response to oxytocin. All right. This is basically the same thing, just another view of it. So estrogen induces oxytocin receptors in the uterus. Then here's the process. It doesn't show the cervix here, but imagine oxytocin stimulates the contractions, also activates prostaglandins, which stimulate more contractions. This causes a positive feedback, and round and round and round until the baby's born. All right. So, being that we are mammals, placental mammals, not only is there placenta, but there are mammary glands that play a role, typically post-pregnancy. Mammary glands are modified sweat glands. You remember when we were talking early on, we were talking about exocrine glands with epithelium. We mentioned that mammary glands are a modified sweat gland. So instead of producing sweat, they produce milk. The basic functional unit of the mammary glands are what are called alveoli. And these individual structures are called alveoli, if you remember the alveoli of the lungs, right? Within each alveoli, we have these cells called epithelial milk secreting cells. I wish they would come up with a more creative name. But these typically at the time of childbirth or shortly thereafter, these cells begin secreting milk that travels down the duct and is eventually released to a nursing baby. In addition to these milk secreting cells, we have a second cell called myoepithelial cell, which is a modified smooth muscle cell. When we think of smooth muscle, we think of contraction. And that's exactly what these cells do. So not only do we have cells that make the milk, but these myoepithelial cells contract, which helps to squeeze the milk out. Now, as you might assume, just like every other aspect of reproduction, this is all orchestrated by the endocrine system. So it's called the milk ejection reflex. And first of all, there's a couple of different parts to it. Number one, we have what triggers the milk injection reflex, and this is the suckling stimulus, basically the baby nursing. When the baby starts nursing, this activates a nerve that travels to the hypothalamus. We've already heard about this in terms of with oxytocin, with the onset of labor or parturition. But in this case, the nerves go to the hypothalamus and trigger the release of two hormones from the pituitary. One is the one that you're familiar with, oxytocin. In this case, it actually is responsible for milk ejection. So much like oxytocin in the uterus stimulates contraction of those smooth muscle cells, oxytocin in the mammary gland stimulates contraction of those myoepithelial cells to eject milk so the baby is able to receive it. Now the milk is removed obviously by the baby, so that has to be replaced, and this is replaced by another hormone called prolactin. The last part of that word kind of is a giveaway. If you think of lactose or lactate, this is the hormone prolactin that stimulates those epithelial cells to produce milk. So we have the removal of milk, the production of milk. Removal, production. All right, so that takes us to the end of the reproductive system, basically the end of all of our lectures. Let me spend a little bit of time going over the study guide, which I think should be pretty straightforward. We've just covered reproduction, but of course there's going to be some urinary on it as well. So I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about urinary, less time on reproductive because that should be pretty fresh in your mind. With the urinary system, what did we learn about? Let's see. We learned about, of course, the organs of the urinary system, including the kidneys, the ureter, right, the bladder and the urethra, the 4 organs. We spent most of the time talking about the kidney. Now, all the organs are important, but remember the kidney is really the functional unit. This is really the workhorse of the urinary system, because this is what's doing all those different processes in order to not only form urine, but to ensure the blood, the constituents of the blood are maintained. So you need to know the anatomy of the kidney. Remember, we spoke about the capsule, the hilus, the cortex, the medulla, different regions like that. If we zoom in on the kidney, remember we learned that the main functional unit of the kidney is a nephron. Nephron, there are millions of nephrons in each kidney. You should know the parts of the nephron. Remember, starting with the glomerulus, right? The glomerular capsule, the proximal tubule, all those different regions. And basically what goes on there, remember the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus, that's where filtration occurs and so on. I also did speak about a specialized region of the nephron called the juxtaglomerular complex, which consists of a couple structures that are important in helping to regulate blood pressure. The kidney is a very integral role in, even though it's a separate system, it has a very integral role or cooperative role in regulating blood pressure. Next, we got into so once we learned the anatomy and the components of the kidney, we learned a bit about the main activities that are taking place. So what exactly is the kidney doing? Well, remember there's 3 main events. There's filtration, resorption, and secretion. And at the end of those 3 different processes, different activities, we now have excretion or urine formation. We spoke about each of these different processes. So filtration, remember what occurs during filtration. Remember I mentioned this is where blood is filtered across that filtration membrane. So you should remember what the filtration membrane is composed of. Remember, we've got the fenestrated epithelium of the glomerulus, the basement membrane, as well as, of course, the podocytes. Remember those podocytes? I used an analogy kind of astrocytes in the sense they wrap around capillaries, but in this case, the podocytes are part of the filtration membrane. 99% of really most of what's filtered into the kidney, and of course that includes water, solutes, nutrients, but no blood and no proteins. 99% of that is reabsorbed back into the blood. It goes into the tubules, so you should know we spoke about that. So we have filtration, which is filtering plasma into the kidney, of course, without the proteins. Most of that is reabsorbed back into the blood. But then there's a small amount of substances that were not initially filtered, but they still gain their way into the tubules. That would be what we call secretion, and that's the movement of toxins, metabolites. Say you take medication, once the medication does its thing, the breakdown products of it need to be eliminated. Hold on a second. Oops, sorry about that. We spoke about the blood supply of the kidney, how it's, the arteries, what are the names of the different arteries and the order, what are the names of the veins and the order that blood passes through them. We then moved on to the ureter, basically just knowing that it's a transport tube, know the histology of it. So remember, this is where we're starting to see at least the lower part of the ureter and the urinary bladder and things, that transitional epithelium that we spoke so often about in the beginning of the semester when we're talking about epithelium. Then we spoke about the urinary bladder, know the histology of that. and the functions. Of course, it's more of a storage site for the urine until we're ready to urinate, or what we call micturate. The histology of it is very important in the micturition reflex. Remember, this is where we have the detrusor muscles, right? And then we, of course, have those internal and external urethral sphincters. Remember, this is all part of the micturition reflex. So you should know that. The concept of the reflex, knowing, remember just very briefly, that as the bladder stretches, as it fills with urine, there are stretch receptors in the bladder wall, in the detrusor muscle, that activate neurons that travel up the spinal cord, ultimately activating the parasympathetic neurons that will come down, trigger contraction of the urinary bladder, and also relax the internal sphincter. So this is all autonomic. And then at the same time, the external sphincter, which is normally closed, involves the role of the somatic nervous system, where that is inhibited to allow the external sphincter to open up. All right, so it seems like it's been a while. Actually, we covered urinary system. Oh my God, it's like almost 2 weeks. It's been a while. Then, of course, male reproductive system. I mean, I'm not going to go through all of this per se. I mean, if you have any specific questions, we covered the organs, again, the anatomy of the organs, starting off, of course, with, before that, learning the endocrine control. Reproduction in both males and females is governed by GnRH from the hypothalamus, then which activates the pituitary hormones, and know that pathway, which ultimately activate the steroid hormones of the gonads. Thermoregulation of the testes, know the temperature control mechanisms. Remember, it's very important that spermatogenesis occur at less than body temperature, roughly 2 to 3 degrees lower. The microscopic anatomy of the testes as well as spermatogenesis. Of course, we've got the different regions of the testes. Remember, we've got the seminiferous tubules, we've got the interstitial tissue. Know the cells that are found in these regions and know what their function is. So spermatogenesis is completed in the seminiferous tubules. Eventually the sperm, once they're mature, they enter into the lumen and they're transported out through a series of tubules, including the epididymis and the vas deferens. Speaking of vas deferens, I did mention a procedure called a vasectomy, which is a contraceptive method that some people utilize, which with the vas deferens is cut, ligated, so sperm is produced, but it cannot be transported. If we think of the pathway of mature sperm from the seminiferous tubules, of course, which are located outside the body cavity in the testes, transported through the epididymis to the vas deferens, into the pelvic cavity, where we encounter the series of glands that are going to provide the fluid now known as semen, consisting of the secretions of these glands, and along with sperm, the secretions plus the sperm are known as semen, and know the characteristics of each of these secretions. I did talk about a condition that does affect one of the glands, that's the prostate. We spoke about BPH and as well as prostate cancer. You should know the different regions of the urethra. Remember, the urethra starts actually just outside the bladder as the tube travels through the prostate gland. So remember, we have the prostatic urethra, the intermediate urethra, and then finally the spongy or the penile urethra. I think in the book it calls it spongy, but it's also known as penile. Then we have the structure of the penis, the names of the erectile tissue, the cavernous spaces, and then, of course, talking about the reproductive response, right? The control of erection, emission, and ejaculation. It's all under autonomic control, so just know how that works. Female reproductive system, okay, kind of similar, at least in the beginning. We spoke about the different organs. Remember the ovaries, the uterine tube, the uterus, and the vagina, their overall functions. Then we spoke a little bit more, quite a bit more about the ovary, the structure of the ovary, the different regions, right? The anatomy, the medulla, the cortex, what's found in the ovary, what occurs in the ovary. Remember, it's oogenesis, as well as development during the menstrual cycle. We spoke about supportive tissue for the ovary. With all these different structures, you need to kind of keep it intact, and that's where the different ligaments come into play. Now, of course, in the ovary, we have these primary oocytes that are protected, that are by what we call a follicle with follicular cells. We spoke about the anatomy of the follicle. Remember what's in it, right? The ovum, what the zona pellucida is, what the different types of follicular cells are, and what they do. Now, we then started talking about the menstrual cycle, which is really an event, or obviously a monthly event, that involves changes in two main organs, the ovaries as well as the uterus. And we call that the change that are occurring in each, we call it the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. I should actually highlight these, not that it matters much. All right. So with the ovarian cycle, remember I mentioned we have 3 phases. Just spoke about that: follicular, ovulation, and luteal phase. What occurs during each of these? What are the hormones involved? Remember, what is the role of FSH? What is the role of LH? Remember, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, stimulates estrogen, and estrogen also helps the egg, the follicles grow and grow and grow until it's time for ovulation. And that's when the primary oocyte, remember, is now a secondary oocyte. Once the egg is mature and ovulates, the egg then enters into the uterine tube. Again, if we draw a comparison with males, remember, once the sperm are mature, they're released, and they eventually work their way into the epididymis and then the vas deferens. So the structure of the uterine tube, remember I mentioned that we have cilia, the ciliated epithelium, and the muscle, which are important in moving the egg down the reproductive tract during a normal menstrual cycle, as well as if that egg is fertilized. Then we spoke about the uterus, the anatomy of the uterus, the different regions, as well as the histological layers, the changes that are occurring during the different phases of the cycle. I spoke about the uterine blood supply, primarily focusing on the uterine artery, and then ending really in what we call the spiral arteries, which help to supply the endometrium. Remember, the endometrium is the crucial tissue that undergoes the cyclical changes that occur during the menstrual cycle. I mentioned, of course, that what happens, remember, one of the key things is that if an egg isn't fertilized, there's no need to keep the uterus thick, the endometrium thick. And I mentioned, of course, that when there is no fertilized egg, remember, progesterone levels decrease because of the shrinkage of the corpus luteum, and this causes this vasoconstriction, which causes the death of the endometrial cells, which are eventually sloughed off. Related to the blood supply, I did talk about uterine fibroids, what they are, and how that embolization procedure works in dissolving, hopefully at least shrinking, or hopefully just dissolving the tumor. From the uterus, we spoke about the vagina, the structure of it, and the functions. Remember, we've got the what type of epithelium, the presence of rugae, why that's important. And then finally, so what we've been talking about thus far really is what happens during a non-fertile cycle, right? Up here with the uterine cycle and the general structure. Then we started taking a look at the changes and what needs to occur for fertilization. We spoke about the acrosome reaction, the cortical reaction, why those are important, and not only fertilizing an egg, but then preventing a second sperm or a third sperm from reaching the egg. Once an egg is fertilized, normal process is that it's implanted in the body of the uterus. So what occurs during that? We spoke about the placenta. What are the parts of the placenta? What are its functions? Finally, of course, we've made it through, or woman has made it through the entire 9 months. And now it's time for childbirth to occur, the onset of labor. This is also has an endocrine component to it, very important. We spoke about that, the relationship between cervical stretch, nerves, oxytocin, contraction, prostaglandins. You should know that, all that pathway. And of course, being mammals as well, we have mammary glands. They're the production of milk from those mammary glands by way of alveoli. Also has an endocrine component to it, including oxytocin, remember, which is the same hormone that's important in parturition, also stimulates milk ejection due to stimulus from the baby, the suckling. But there's also a second hormone, which is prolactin, which stimulates milk production. So we have the removal of milk, ejection, due to the contraction of those myoepithelial cells. And then we have the production of milk by way of prolactin. And that, as they say, oh, we got 6 people here. All right. All right. So that takes us to the end of all the material. I haven't even checked to see if anyone has any questions. No. Anyone have any questions?
I don't know.
Okay.
Is extra credit, it was due today. Right?
Today is, yeah, I'm actually gonna, 27th, I'm gonna extend it to the 28th. So yeah, so the extra credit, those 10 points, if that's for the 2 different papers, that's due tomorrow. Let's see, so the exam is worth 100 points. It's like 2 exams combined. It's going to be mostly multiple choice. There will be some true false. There may be an essay question, possibly. I probably seriously doubt it. But there might be, I wouldn't call it an essay. I would call it more of a short answer. The lab exam obviously is on the same day as the lecture exam. I'll be sending more details about that. But like I mentioned, either later today or tomorrow, I will be sending you guys out a kind of a practice exam for the lab. So this is actually our last meeting. And since I won't be seeing you guys on the test, so, well, it's been an interesting semester. I've enjoyed, I'm glad I had a chance to meet you guys, at least in the beginning of the semester. It's interesting this summer, I'm teaching a class over at SDSU. We actually just started yesterday. I'm teaching an animal physiology class. And so we started yesterday from the get-go. I'm so-called meeting my 90 students online. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, I think we've kind of learned a lot this semester with online teaching, but I prefer the classroom more. So if there's no other questions, look for the practice exam later, lab exam later today or tomorrow. And I'll send you more information about the timing for the lecture exam. It's going to be the same, pretty much. I think those that are normally in the morning class, it'll start at 8 o'clock, and you'll have a period of time to go over it. Those that have already spoke with me with need the extra time, you will be getting that.
Can we just email you about that?
Yes, definitely send me a reminder. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. Also, those of you in the afternoon, it'll start at the usual time, like 12:45. And what I'll probably do, I'll probably give you guys like a little break between the end of the lecture exam and the lab exam, so you guys kind of have a chance to either grab something to eat or just decompress or something like that. So have a great rest of the summer, I guess, as much as we can. It looks like things are slowly opening up. I just read today that they're going to start opening up haircut places this week. So very excited about that. I've tried to manage, but you know, and restaurants are opening up. So hang in there, be safe. And just as a note, in the future, if any of you guys, if you need a letter of reference for school you're applying to or whatever, please let me know. Definitely give me a fair amount of time. I mean, I don't mean, you know, months and months, but typically I like to have at least a few weeks, if not more, from when it's requested to when it's actually due. So definitely be glad to help with that. Even though we're not on campus, obviously this is something that can still be done. So, all right, everybody, have a great rest of the day, and hope to see you soon.